Hello everyone and welcome back to Sidd'sTechnolog. I'm your host Siddharth Chauhan. This is the last video of the series which we put out last year where we start learning about SQL Server, like installing stuff like that. And we cannot end this series without learning very basic and important topic, that is what are the ACID properties which an RDBMS system offers and what kind of files are there in SQL Server, right? So let's get started. Of course, you all know me. I am Siddharth Chauhan. I have over 12 years of experience working as Microsoft SQL Server Database Administrator, and as well as I am MCSA Microsoft Certified in SQL Server 2016. So let's move on to our topic. So first thing first, let us talk about what is ACID properties. So ACID here are actually four initials A, C, I, D from the four properties which we are going to discuss in a minute. And these properties are something every RDBMS system has to conform to in order to provide consistency of the database as well as transactions. All right. So let us see what are these ACID properties. So of course, first thing first is atomicity. So here A stands for atomicity, which means that all of your modifications will happen or none of them will happen. So by this, so something similar to an atom, your transaction is the basic unit of your RDBMS system, and transaction can have one or more commands written into it. And by this atomicity property, what we means is that all of these transactions will either get executed or none of them will be finalized. So in case of a successful transaction has to ensure all the commands were successful as well along with it. All right. Now why? And the second property defines is why it is required, because we or any RDBMS system has a owner has responsibility to provide consistency of your data, right? So in case any transaction is happen and let's suppose that transaction get errored out, it should not leave your database into in a half finished state, right? So the state of the database at the start of your transaction and at the end of your transaction has to be so it consistent data state, right? So this is what the second property states. Now of course, when we are talking about an RDBMS system, our database is generally serving as a backend layer for an application which is storing the data. An application can be anything. It could be a banking system, it can be a ticketing system, and there can be many users which will be currently working on a database, right? So we need our RDBMS system needs a mechanism where all these users can work in parallel without impacting each other, right? If they are accessing a data, this should not be impacting the other person. And this property, the mechanism which is comes under this is the isolation property. So the isolation property states that the each transaction should be running in a separate kind of layer or separate to each other, so that they until the time they are finished, so that they do not impact each other, right? So this is isolation property. And the last property in this list is durability. And durability is to guarantee that your database or RDBMS system is keeping track of all the changes that is happening on your system, right? So in case of any abnormal termination, the RDBMS system will check this change tracker where all the changes have been happening, and it will check whether a particular transaction was successful or not. And if it was not, of course, like it has to conform to those two properties which we have mentioned above, atomicity and consistency. Ultimately, we have to provide a consistent data at the end. So this property or this by implementing this property, we can help to ensure whether our transaction was successful or not, and whether our database should be in a consistent state or not. And durability, especially this durability property, it is implemented using something called transaction log files in SQL Server, right? And of course, that hints to our next topic, like what exactly, how many type of files are there in our SQL Server, right? So In SQL Server, actually there are two major type of files, which is data files and transaction log files. So and these are arranged into these four level hierarchy levels. As you can see, at the top level is your databases, or your system database, or it can be your user database. Then user database would have two major files. One is data file and one is transaction log file. Okay, there is something called file groups. Okay, so and file groups are generally applicable to your data file, right? And why it is not applicable to your transaction log file? Because transaction log file has a very dedicated purpose, is that it is just keeping a track of all the transactions that is happening, right? Whereas in the data file you can have multiple purpose. You can maybe have some few tables in one file, few tables in another file, or maybe data in where you can have just indexes, stuff like that. So you can have multi-varied purpose, whereas a transaction is very focused purpose, and that's why there is no file group. And with this you can understand the purpose of file groups. So the file groups are something just like folders in your system, right? This is just a logical container. This does not have any physical entity. They are just used to categorize, if you want, in any manner your files. So it can have one or more files. It can even have zero files. You can have a file group which is empty, maybe you have created and not using it. So you can, but still again you have a folder and you can have one or more files into it. And then you have the last layer, which has all your physical data files and transaction log files. So by default, when you create a database, what gets created is the first file group which gets created is your primary file group. And of course, because it is the first file group, it is also your default file group. And the default file which is created is something known as master file, the single file which gets created. So there is one data file and one transaction log file gets created with each database. This first file is known as the master file. Now if you check on books online or online documentation, you will find that you can have only one master file of your database. But in practical, and which is denoted by like MDF extension, master data file extension. And but in practical you can see that you can have one master data file per file group. Okay, so and that's why that is denoted here, so that you have a primary file group, and then you can have one or more user defined file groups like fg1 here, and then you have master files in each of these file groups. And after that, after the first master file, whatever files you created are categorized into same category, something called as secondary data file, which is denoted by ndf. Now here n comes because like in alphabetical order n comes after m, so that's why this is all of these files are denoted by ndf, right? Instead of like master data file which had master, had some purpose. Transaction log files is known as log data files, so that's why they have ldf. But here the and secondary log file, it is ndf. Okay, so you can have one or more secondary files in any in your one or more file groups. So this is a particular type of hierarchies. One property which I would like to discuss about your transaction log files is that your transaction log files, unlike your data log files, are continuous in nature. By that what I mean is that you can have more than one transaction log file. Yes, you can have that. But what happens, let's suppose I have two transaction log files. So what SQL Server does is that once your first transaction log file get full, then and only then it will move to your secondary transaction log file. Okay, so it is something kind of a list, a big list, which is in continuous in nature. So all no, doesn't matter how many transaction log files you have, it will keep on using them in sequential manner. Okay, unlike data files where you have multiple data split across multiple files, and SQL Server will be doing IO simultaneously depending on all of these files. Okay, so this is a particular nature about transaction log file, and that's why we generally do not create more than one transaction log file. All right. So here you go, folks. This is how files are arranged. The type of files are there in SQL Server and how they are arranged in SQL Server. Right. I really hope you find this information useful. Please click on thumbs up icon if you like this video and share with your folks, as well as do not forget to subscribe our channel and hit that bell icon to stay updated. Thanks, Dale. Thanks for joining in today. See you around.